announcements as we begin this morning. I'm going to step aside.
Just real quick. Hi guys. 64 degrees and I'm still sweating. Okay, just real quick. Everyone now should have a name tag if you're on the roster. So let me know. Now, I don't know if you're on the roster unless you officially become on the roster, and this is how we ask that you do that. And there's a process, and let me tell you why. Fill it out, and there's a couple of different sheets, and then Dave gives me one. So I know, even before you're actually put on the roster, that I need to print out a name tag. And I'm not looking at the roster every week. So this helps, and it expedites things. So if you want to be on the roster, if you're not sure, fill one of these out. Dave will make sure that you get on the roster and make sure that I have one of these pieces of paper so I can get you a name tag. If you don't see your name tag out there, and I didn't make this clear, we only have so many plastic little doohickeys, sleeves, but you have a name tag. And don't feel bad about taking someone's name out and just leave it on the table and then take their sleeve. And we'll just kind of keep doing that until we get in a rhythm where the majority of us who are here all the time always have a little plastic sleeve. Okay? So, Lynette, you have a name tag. Yay! Because we got it this morning and made you one because I forgot yesterday. So it's just out there.
I had a Stilton plastic sleeve.
Yeah, see, Kristen's already stealing things without even telling me.
I think someone is in the hospital, so I figured they could be here.
Yeah.
That's very thoughtful.
So not only she's stealing, but she's stealing from
To be honest, Dot told me to do that. Dot
Of
said,
course she did.
she said, this person's not here, they're in the hospital. So I was
then
like,
it makes it okay. If Dot says it, then it's okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm visually impaired. Somebody will have to read this to me later.
Okay. Well, you're on the roster, so you're good.
And you got a name tag.
So you're good, Peaches. I finally, it only took us a month, I think, to get yours, Peaches. Okay, so that's one announcement. The second announcement is I am going to send Dave today just a little snippet of kind of a summary of what our class bereavement policy is, or plan of action for when a member passes away. And it's options. And I'm just asking for you to read it. Email me back with the subject line A, B, or C. There's option A, B, or C. So I give you a preview. It's real easy. A is, a book. B is a flower arrangement. And C is both. That would come from our class funds. So if you vote for that, know that you are, opting to obviously participate in our class funds as well. I didn't put the service because I think that should be a given. That's just me. If you want to write me a note and say I don't have the authority to say that, that's fine. But I think that we should always provide like the sweets, the brownies, and the cookies, and greeters and hosts when the service is held here at Wilshire. So I kind of put that in an email, kind of a plan of action, and then I'm just asking for you guys to vote to see what you think is the best. If you have a better option, just write it in the body of the email. But I didn't want to take too much time, so in the subject, you can just click my email. That's in there. So you'll click my email, subject line A, B, or C, send. Unless you have something else to tell me, and feel free to tell it to me. I think that's all I have.
Okay.
Except for, we
Oh,
got a
yeah.
thank you. We have a thank you. Thanksgiving, I'll get that. This is from the Helms family. And I can leave it if you guys want to read it. I can read most of it, I think. My eyesight goes with pregnancy also, by the way. It does. It just says that their family wants to thank our class for the beautiful flower arrangement for June's service. The class did a wonderful job hosting the reception after the service. It gave their family and friends comforting time to share with one another. Everyone enjoyed the fantastic cookies, especially the great grandchildren. However, most of all, they wanted to thank us for the love and friendship and fellowship and spiritual support that we offered to Jean. The class was an important part of her life. So thank you, and that's kind of what that says. So I'll leave it up there if anyone wants to read it. Yes, ma'am.
Have you been reimbursed for the flowers from the class?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Easy answer. Thank you for that. Yes. Last thing I think is we have the clipboard for Thanksgiving on the 19th after the 11 o'clock service. Doing that from memory. Is that
Yeah,
right?
it's November 19th, Thanksgiving luncheon. We're going to have Discovery class tables.
Been around a couple times.
Because we got how many people signed up?
We didn't get to, we never came over here.
We're going to take over the Thanksgiving luncheon.
42. Okay, so let's start here and let's just pass it back down.
Come in, sir, find a seat.
For name tag.
Hello, Donna.
One more time.
One of the options for the Thanksgiving to give is either buy the groceries like we do,
Yes.
or to go in as a class and buy a basket.
Yes.
Are we thinking along those lines of something?
You haven't seen that yet.
Nope.
Heather is enlisting some of our classes in addition or in place of the Thanksgiving canned goods that you bring. Some classes are doing baskets that are like a whole thing.
Whole dinner.
Yeah, and our class is big enough to probably do 2 baskets if we wanted to do that. So Shannon's hopefully gonna have a baby this week.
It's not looking like it. Due date's on Tuesday. Update on, if I don't have it, I will go in Sunday for an induction.
Okay,
Anyway,
yeah. Let's figure that out this week, Donna.
how do you-
Do we have a missions leader? We don't.
We do Shannon, but she's not here.
Oh,
I
Shannon.
don't know if she got that email.
Okay.
We've been in
We'll work-
touch.
work with
I'll
Shannon.
work with Heather on it.
All right, Terry will take care of it.
Okay, and then just CC me. Okay, one quick thing, and then we gotta get started in class. If you're on the roster, that means all you have to do is check mark your name. Some people are writing their names, and that's lovely. But when I go through every month and I'm trying to get an attendance sheet, I'm having to like dual compare. So just don't take the time to write your name. Just give me a check mark, because when you write your name in and you check mark, sometimes it throws me off just a little bit, slows me down.
Some of you want to get double counted.
So, and I'm not double counting. So,
Like you
and
want
then,
double credit.
and the best way to contact me really is text or email. So comment suggestions, what have you. If the phone rings and I don't know the number and I'm in the middle of a diaper change, that's not really happening. But I can multitask and tell Siri to text or email, and that works out great. So with that, I'm gonna be quiet. Thanks, guys.
I just have to.
Quick thing.
Yes, Dave.
Anybody didn't contribute to the class kitty that hadn't been here the last couple of times, I've got it over here. And one more thing about responding to the email. My email address is in the body of that email. You have to respond to me. If you hit return, it goes back to the church. Because this is the church's database. I never see that. I don't see those responses unless you send it back to me.
Yeah, it's generated out of the church database.
Yeah, not my lips.
Wonderful technology. Okay. I just all of this technical stuff. I just have to stop and bask in the glow of appreciation because our class has come such a long way, baby. Pat.
I was going to tell you about this. When I was at the home thing, I asked George, I said, why does our class get to have a video? Because they were talking about video clips from the classes for
Yes.
visitors. And he said, well, Mark is special. So I want you to know that from George.
I'm glad George said that. And by the way, if you've not gone to a home fellowship yet, I hope you will. They're a lot of fun. We've had a tremendous response to this. There's 5 more, including one tonight over at the Perry's down in Lakewood. Just a lovely informal conversation, and you get to know people that you don't know, and no one's pushing you for anything. You don't have to sign up for anything. It is no pressure, no commitment on anything. It is just really talking about the church, and it's a good time. So hope you'll do that. A lot of prayer concerns when we get to that at the end of the lesson today. I do want to just preview that. I don't want to go into all the details right now, but one of our class members, Steve Green, is in critical condition at Parkland Hospital, and I will give you more details on that. There was an email that went out earlier, and we will continue to talk about that as well. Let's see. It seems like it's been a long time. We're still studying Titus, believe it or not, and who knew? So today we're in Titus chapter 3. We actually, I think, pretty much finished up chapter 2 last week because I just shoved us on through. So we're in Titus chapter 3, and I'm hoping that we can make it through 8 verses today.
Oh, my goodness.
I know that's ambitious.
Yeah, real ambitious.
1 and 2. Good Lord, we need to be done with this before Easter.
Easter.
How about Christmas?
Yeah.
No, we're going to be done by Advent, if I have to chop it off. Okay, would someone volunteer to read for us Titus chapter 3, verses 1 through 8? Who's my reader today? All right, Dorel.
Remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient and to be ready for every good works, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show every courtesy to everyone. For we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, for we ourselves, where am I? For we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, despicable, hating one another. But when the goodness of loving kindness of God, our Savior, appeared, He saved us, not because of any works of righteousness that we had done, but according to His mercy through the water of rebirth and renewal by the Holy Spirit. This Spirit He poured out on us richly through Jesus Christ our Savior, so that having been justified by His grace, we might become heirs according to the hope of eternal life. The saying is short.
That's good right there. We'll stop right there. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Terrell. Well, I hope we can get past verse 1 today. Because this is a real stumbling block, I think. Remind them, Paul says to Titus, to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be all these other things. It's that rulers and authorities thing that's going to hang us up pretty badly today. Now, let me remind you that we think Titus is somewhere in Crete during this time. And I want to just give you a little background from an older commentator of days gone by, who wrote about this context that maybe help us get through this. He says, how were the people of Christ, this early church, to regulate their behavior in their dealings with the vast pagan world outside? St. Paul goes to the root of the matter at once when he says, put them in mind to do this. Very needful in Crete was such a reminder respecting obedience. The island had, when St. Paul wrote to Titus, been some century and a quarter under Roman rule. The previous government had been democratic, and historians like Polybius, who have written of Crete, have dwelt particularly on the turbulent and factious spirit which animated their people, added to which the many Jews who we know formed a very large part of the Christian church there, always impatient of a foreign yoke, would in such an atmosphere of excitement be especially eager to assert their right to be free from the hated rule of Rome. So there's potentially some context to this. Now, remember earlier in Titus we had these household codes about obeying that we struggled with. And we talked then about how what Paul probably had in mind, you got to keep the big picture in mind, but what Paul was probably trying to say there was, if you're going to be a witness for the gospel in the place where you live, you need to not upend every social convention right now. There's a greater day coming, but it's not now. So we look at Paul there saying, be patient. So one thing to be said about this is not everything that is expedient in the moment is necessary for all time. Because we got to look at the greater witness of Scripture. But when we look at this, and Paul is telling Titus to urge these young believers to be subject to rulers and authorities. And now there's an interesting problem with the text here. Scholars debate whether that little word "and" is actually there or not, because it's implied. So some interpret this, and some of your English interpretations may show this. Some interpret this to be rulers who are authorities. Some interpret it to be rulers and authorities. Some interpret it to be spiritual rulers in authority. Some interpret it to be anybody who's in authority. So there's discussion that you can have around that. But the bottom line is, I mean, you can wiggle your way out of it. There's still a teaching here to be subject to whoever's in authority over you. Now,
Not different from today's world.
it's not. And here's the problem with that. The people who I encounter who are the most eager to want everyone to be subject to rulers and authorities are usually eager to do that when they like the rulers and authorities.
Or they are the rulers.
Or they are. And you don't hear them preaching this verse too much when they don't like the rulers and authorities.
Mark,
Yes.
I wondered about this. It says to be subject to rulers and authorities. If you think about that being the Roman authorities, it says also to do whatever's good. And they couldn't do whatever's good if they're subject to the Romans. So
So now you got to the logic problem. Yeah. And here's where you got to read between the lines. And most every commentator you're going to read on this passage, who's not crazy, in my view, most every commentator is going to say this should never be read as superseding the moral law of God. So to be subject to rulers and authorities, even Roman rulers and authorities, is not to engage in immoral, ungodly acts and say, well, I'm just following the Scripture and being subject to rulers and authorities. Linda?
Okay, my version, which is the Message, makes it a little easier.
Good.
It says, remind the people to respect the government and be law-abiding, always ready to lend a helping hand. Now, that's not much you can argue with, It doesn't
Yeah.
sound like you're being beaten down by some horrible thing. It just says respect the government.
Right. So let me remind us that the Message is a loose interpretation.
It's a good one, though.
But it's good, and it helps us see it in a new way. It's almost Scripture, Preston says. It's 2 steps above the Living Bible. So, some of our biblical texts are translations, literal translations, and others are interpreted translations. And that's the benefit of this, because it gives us some insight into it, and it helps us think about this along the way. So immediately, our minds go to following state, city, federal laws, right? And whoever's elected into any of those places, right? And again, the problem I find in the church about this is inconsistency. Because you can hear a pretty good speech from Christian folks about how important it is to be law-abiding when they like the law. But suddenly we're silent when we don't like the law. And so who's the protester? It flips, right? So my question to you is, how do we find a consistent way to interpret this that transcends presidential administrations, governorships, mayorships, city councilorships, school board superintendents, or whatever. How do we boil this down in a way that can be helpful to us throughout all time? Joni?
Isn't this at least similar to the whole render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God?
I think that's a fair assessment.
I mean, at least similar along whatever the message is supposed to be.
Don't be an unnecessary pain.
Yeah.
Don't be a rabble-rouser for no good cause, right? Yeah? Chad, help us.
I have a note here, because it talks about, the Romans have been there since the BC 67, so the 150th year. And this note says that it leans more towards, it says Christians should keep aloof from seditions, which could work evil. So to me, it's almost like I have people in my family that love to comment on everything that's put on Facebook. And to the point where it's like, this is what Jesus says about that. And it's like, to me, that's just, you really tear down anything. And I think that's what he's saying is just stay out of that. Like this, if you look at it in that time, you have this sedition, people don't like the Romans. And to me, it's almost like he's just saying, just stay out of that. Just respect the rule that's there and be a Christian. I think,
And yet, we're also called to be advocates for people who are downtrodden. So how do you balance that, Dan?
This is purely political, but for any of you that watched Ken Burns' series on the Vietnam War,
Yes.
50 years later, all those war protesters were correct. So,
Yeah.
sometimes you just have to take a stand.
But there's a way to do so that's within kind of what you said, like to use that rule of God's, there's a way to protest and to go about making change within the laws of the authority, or there's a way to do that doesn't, I guess, go get kind of what Chad's saying, that doesn't, I don't know how to put it, but yeah, there's a way to do it that doesn't go against God's rule.
So I think part of this, you guys are both getting at this, that's really helpful. Most of us have a hard time taking a long view. And this is one of the things I've written my congressman about repeatedly in the past year. And have said to them, they're not listening to me. But the thing I have said is, consider your legacy. How do you want to be remembered by your grandchildren?
They don't care.
How do you want to be remembered by your grandchildren? And I think that's about attitude as well as action, right? How did you conduct yourself? Did you turn a blind eye to injustice? Did you not speak up when you could have, even though you have principles that are being violated? And that, to me, is something that transcends time, regardless of who's in power. How have you used the power that you had? So another interesting exercise is to assume you're an elected official in America today, and you read this passage. What does it say to you? Who are you subject to? Who are your rulers and authorities in our democratic system?
Theoretically, it's your constituents.
That's right. That's the way our system is set up. Now, Paul, in writing this to Titus, could not have conceived of the kind of democracy we live in today. I mean, there was a history of some democracy, but our political system that we live in obviously didn't exist in that time. And so we've got some interpolation that we have to do out of this. I guess one of the big challenges is about how you go about what you're going to do. Are you going to spoil the gospel by your blind endorsement of someone else. Right?
Mark, Jesus said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and then your neighbors yourself. On these hang all the law and prophets. It's just have to love each other. You know?
And we're going to get to that in this same passage, in a way, right, Donna?
What do you think about Romans 13, which Paul wrote, which really expands on this one sentence he wrote in Titus? And that's a whole 2 or 3 lessons right there about.
Give us the quick summary of Romans 13.
Romans just 1,
Yeah.
verse 1, everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and in those positions of authority have been placed there by God.
Yeah,
So
that's
anyone-
going in my black letter edition of the Bible.
Yeah, so anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished, and so forth and so on. So,
Yeah.
how do you
I
know?
told you last week about Thomas Jefferson's Bible, right? He sort of cut it up.
Yeah.
With the parts he made his own Bible, and some days I want to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the part we don't like.
Yeah. So again, context is everything in this. But the other thing I want to say to us is consistency is important. Right? I think where I get the most impatient is with hypocrisy.
You must stay impatient a lot.
It's why I'm just a mental wreck right now. Absolutely. I mean, what's good today needs to be good tomorrow, right? Along the way. Now, let's see. What have I not said about this? I think I said everything I need to say about that. Look at the end of verse 1. It gets modified, not only to be obedient, but to be ready for every good work. The thrust of what Paul's saying to Titus is that the early church needs to be involved in doing good, not in doing bad. Now, we could make the case that there are times in world history when you've got to do bad in order to do good. I mean, think of horrendous abuses that go on in other parts. So think of, the easy case is World War II and atrocities, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer is certainly the classic illustration of this. A German pastor who became part of the resistance to Hitler and actually plotted to assassinate Hitler. Now, I don't think you can find in the Bible a command from Paul to assassinate evil rulers. But that's what seemed to be the greater good at that point. Where's the line? Right? Difficult. Really, really difficult. Be ready for every good work. Verse 2, to speak evil of no one and to avoid quarreling. Now, here's my obligatory Tom Wright quote of the week. I think I maybe didn't have one last week. The point of verse 2, he says, is not just that God has decided to set up some new rules for the sake of it, and that one of them happens to be that Christians should be nice to people. The reason for the early Christian rule of life is always more deep-rooted than that. The reason we are summoned to avoid speaking evil of people, not to be quarrelsome, and so on, is that we are ourselves the creatures of God's generous love. And if we aren't showing that same generous, kindly, forgiving love, we have obviously forgotten the path by which we've come. And that's what Paul goes on to say here to the early church is, look, we all have been down in the sewer ourselves. We know what we are capable of, and we need to never forget where we've come from and what we are capable of doing if we're going to have grace with other people. And so elsewhere he says, let your gentleness be evident to all. That's hard, right? That's hard because there are times in life, and we're in one of those times now, and there are other times on different causes where gentleness doesn't seem to get anything done.
It's steamrolled.
Yeah, I mean, you'll just get run flat over and not be effective in that. So rather than just talk about our current situation, let's go back, roll the clock back a few years. There's nothing in the religious cultural wars in America that's been more divisive than the abortion debate. And a lot of evangelical Christians have been at the forefront of that debate, often with a worthy cause, but with an unworthy method. Right? And in their haste and zeal to uphold life, they've resorted to death. And that's easy for us to see standing back here, but you see there's a tipping point somewhere, and what I think we all struggle with is where's the tip, right? Where's the tip? Anyone got an idea? Pat, it's a fulcrum, right? You got to figure out where the seesaw is going to go.
Well, doesn't that just kind of go back to all extremists, no matter what your cause? I mean, because most people that are opposed to abortion don't believe blowing up abortion clinics are the way to deal with it. I mean, that's
right.
And that's for every issue and every religion and every cause that's not religious at all. I mean, when you go to an extreme, I mean, people end up getting hurt, or you end up basically fighting what you're against with the same thing you're against.
Yeah, I mean, it's like domestic violence is this way, in a way. When too often in our frustration against something bad happening, we create more bad by trying to correct the bad, right? People do this in all sorts of areas of life. You get in financial trouble and you make a mistake that makes your financial trouble actually worse, right? Or fill in the blank. All sorts of. We do that. Cody, help me out.
The Living Bible makes it kind of simple, but it says doing everything with love and patience. We got off the track somewhere in America. You know, it's like the Vietnam War. My husband was not in Vietnam. If he'd had 6 more months, he would have gone to Vietnam. We were stationed in Germany. But, I mean, that was what we were told to do, in addition to how high we could cut our grass and best housing. So you had authority figures that were maybe trying to make the best decisions, and I don't know, it's back to the tipping point. I'm not defending Vietnam or anything. I'm just saying that there certain times, I mean, if you're in the military, which is an organization that you do, and you do so much, and you show up at 4 in the morning or whatever. Yeah. And I'm not saying that's great or bad.
Well, but it's the way it is.
I mean, it is. And therefore the tipping point sometimes is a little bit different than someone that is an IBM executive going to a building in Dallas or something, that particular month or something. So it's very hard. I think I've learned so much from that Jewish and Christian
Musar.
Yes, Musar. And if we had all just stuck to love and patience, I mean, we would have been so much better off in the world.
Yeah, Pat?
I was going to say on that Vietnam War, though, I don't know if any of you have watched it, because I did too, and they rolled some film in there showing what the president said that were involved in the war behind the scenes, and they knew what was going on, and they made decisions anyway without thinking about those young boys they were sending to America to get just chewed up. So they even kind of admitted now that they were wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, so here's the interesting idea. Let me put you in a different place now. Imagine yourself as an employee in the Weinstein Company in Hollywood.
Are you ready?
Imagine yourself as someone who's dependent upon that company for your employment, and you know bad things are going on, what do? We ask, why has this taken so long to come out? This is the very issue. Should you be subject to the authority of your employer in that case?
Well, and that whole system, the whole Hollywood system was so corrupted, as they keep saying over and over again. Harvey was not the only one doing this stuff.
Right.
So you've got your individual employer that you may or may not feel pretty loyal to, and it's all skewed because everybody's doing that.
So gentleness and meekness doesn't seem to go a long way in solving this, because you're enabling other victims to pile up, right? It's not as easy as it sounds here, right? Not as easy as it sounds. And yet, we can do frivolous things that only make the thing worse as well. So wisdom, where does wisdom come in to this, right? To know how to handle any situation. All right. This thought of kindness and gentleness, how is our exhibition of gentleness and kindness a part of God's appearing in the world? Because Paul has told Titus that with God's appearance in the world comes God's gentleness and kindness. We're going to see that again in another verse here in just a minute. How are we part of that? Anyone?
I don't either. Can you reword the question?
You mean when we act in gentleness and kindness instead of out of malice, how is that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, have you ever thought about that you are being the representative of God? In that,
I think that's what stops a lot of us from going to being quick tempered. You're like, wait a second. I know better. I've learned better. I am better. I can be better. I think some of that is what stops.
Yeah.
Because the humanness wants to take over. The human wants
to take over. Hopefully, the faith that we have is a bit of a regulator on us. Right. Some of y'all are experienced enough to have worked with pressure cookers before. I'm inexperienced. I have cooked in a pressure cooker before. You don't see it as much anymore, right? But what happens is you have this big pot that's closed, and you apply heat to it, and it creates pressure and steam inside. But what is there on the top of that? There's a little valve that lets, when it gets to the blowing up point, it lets a little steam off, right? So it can keep the pressure going, but it doesn't blow the house to bits, right? That's a pressure cooker. And hopefully our faith is, on good days, like that valve that helps us not blow our tops. But it's a struggle for all of us, right? Maybe I'm just talking about me.
No, you're talking about all of us.
All of us.
Right.
I started to say, Mark, doesn't that sort of go into the letter of the law and the spirit of the law?
Well, of course.
I mean, you have to make a decision, and it is a personal thing. And hopefully you make the right one.
So Paul goes on to say to Titus, again, remember where you come from. Remember where you've come from. And we ourselves once were foolish people. We've been led astray. And the notion here is humility again. Because all of us have got to be able to say, there but for the grace of God go I. Right? Is this idea of moral superiority or failing to see ourselves in other people, right? That dehumanizes, I think. And I could get off on a whole long discourse on that we don't have time for today. I do want you to look at verse 4. But, despite all that, But when the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, he saved us, despite our shortcomings. When the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, God saved us not because of any works of righteousness we had done, but according to his mercy. Now, verse 4, these are two really interesting words I want to talk about for a minute. The NRSV translates them goodness and loving kindness. What are some other translations? What do some of the other translations say there in verse 4? Kindness and love. What does the Message say?
Kind and loving.
Kind and loving. Anyone else? These are two really special words, and they can get interchanged. It's going to sound a little funny. This word that's first of all translated goodness in the NRSV is a word that means, in its just strictest meaning, useful kindness. Useful kindness. It's like the joke I hear George tell from time to time when kids want to know what kind of doctor he is. And sometimes people ask, are you the kind of doctor who can do me any good? Right? In other words, are you a medical doctor? No. This is not just kindness, this is useful kindness here. Meeting real needs in God's way, in God's fashion and timing. This very word is one of the fruit of the Spirit listed in Galatians chapter 5. Loving kindness, useful kindness, practical. So for us as believers, this is a Spirit-produced goodness that meets the need and avoids human harshness or cruelty. One commentator says, there is no term in English that quite carries this notion of the combination of kind and good. It takes us two words put together to get this one word that's here. That's what God has shown to us. Now that sounds a lot like the word we get in English for the next one's loving kindness. Mm-hmm. So what's up with this? It's a translation problem, right? Because the word loving kindness, you're going to recognize the root of it, philanthropia. Mm-hmm. Philanthropia, from which we get our word philanthropy. It means to be a friend of mankind, to be a friend of people, a benefactor, someone who loves others warmly, treats them with respect that befits them being made in the image of God, and shares kindness with them. It is the love of mankind in this word. So we've got useful kindness and the love of mankind demonstrated to us by God himself. This is what God has done for us. And if we're to emulate that, that's our marching orders. Useful kindness, love of humanity. Now, here's where I think this gets really hard. So, I was at the State Fair on Friday, and I saw a guy walking down the way wearing a camouflage t-shirt that said this: Veterans before refugees.
Repeat that.
Veterans before refugees. And I immediately got the point, because I'm assuming this guy's a vet. Maybe, I hope so. And what he's saying is, see me. See my humanity and the fact that I need to be taken care of. But the problem is, he assumes it's a zero-sum game, and we can't do both. And I stood there, frozen, looking at this guy, and thought, why can the wealthiest, most successful nation in the world not do two things at the same time? Does it have to be one or the other?
No.
Can't we love veterans and take care of them? And can't we love refugees and take care of them? I think that's what Jesus says when we see veterans and refugees as human. All human. But we tend to hide behind other veneers, whether it's a flag or a work uniform or a country of origin or a language or whatever, and we fail to see humanity in that. And the standard that Paul is giving Titus is not qualified. God has not shown loving kindness only to some people because they're from the right place.
As a matter of fact,
God has not shown loving kindness to you because you were born in America, or because you were born white, or because you were born into a place where you had access to education, or because you're good looking, or because...
Or you're not.
Or whatever.
I teach this class at El Centro is making ethical decisions, and I show them a video of Arizona where there's a canal there made out of concrete on the Mexican border, and the Mexicans jump in there and try to get to America, and it showed how many hundreds of people die in this canal. So I had the kids make a decision. What would you do? Would you put this? And they would say, you know, move the American border over here, whatever. But it's a dilemma because people are jumping in there to die and dying because they can't get out. The water's too fast, all that kind of stuff. And it's amazing what the kids come up with. But that's one
so
of the
that's
things.
an introduction to this systemic problems, right? And we can't avoid thinking about that because it's too difficult, right? So what Paul is not saying to Titus is just put on your rose-colored glasses, assume everything's going to work out, and think the best of everyone. Loda?
Your pressure cooker. The pressure cooker is all of us trying to do something good for the future. But you've got to have that valve, that tiny little valve, or nothing will work. So what is that valve? Is that somebody yelling in the street to get your attention?
I think it may differ. The point I really want to drill at is I think it's seeing people as human. Mm-hmm. Right? So, back to Vietnam. I've got a column that's going to come out tomorrow that I've been working on about some of this. And, oh, geez. How much time do we have? What is the single most important photographic image that came out of the Vietnam War?
The little girl.
Napalm Girl.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Didn't
Napalm Girl.
photographer get a Nobel Prize?
Pulitzer.
Pulitzer.
He won a Pulitzer Prize for it. Why is that photo so powerful? It humanized the reality, right? It humanized. Yeah.
But I think it's because it's a child. If it had been a woman or man he'd carried, I don't think it would have had the same message as.
Oh, well, that's interesting, Polly.
Yeah, I think because, I mean, adult, you can say, well, we know humans aren't perfect, so we have issues, we deserve it, what have you, but you know a child doesn't carry anything.
2 years ago when the refugee crisis really stirred up big time, what was the single image that turned the tide of opinion on that?
The little boy on the beach.
The little dead boy on the beach with his Velcro sneakers on, right? You remember that one? Why? Humanity. When we know people, or when we see people who are like us in some way, who we can identify with, it makes us more compassionate. And this is the danger of othering, of building up walls so that you see other people as different. And I think the point Paul's trying to make here is if you take all of Paul's writings together, you ought not think so highly of yourself, right? Because when you do, you forget that you're flesh and blood too, and that you're human. And most of us have a real hard time dealing with our own humanity, much less being able to acknowledge someone else's humanity, right? We want to be invincible, and we forget that sometimes the way we're invincible is by ignoring reality. And
I got so sick of hearing friends say, I couldn't watch the Vietnam series because it's just too sad. I just couldn't watch it. There's a documentary coming out this week, I know it starts this week in New York, where a man was embedded, so to speak, with migrant communities all over the world. We all ought to see that, and I guarantee lots of people will say, I couldn't possibly see it, it's too sad. But it puts you in those camps on a daily basis, and you can see what those people go through.
You know, I think people forget too that missionaries see a lot of that. I mean, we support missionaries.
Right.
My dad had a doctorate. I mean, he was a doctor. He could have earned a lot of money over here in the States, but he went to Africa. He saw babies that were dying under 2 months. He saw people that were dying of leprosy and all this other stuff. And nobody cares about it. I mean, well, they do, but not enough.
Not
you
enough.
know? Yes.
Right.
Because it's happening to them and not me, because you're not putting yourself in them shoes.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. We can get off on a lot more. We're going to, Dave, we're going to pick up at verse 5. Verse 5 next week.
Hey, you got close.
I got
Yes,
close.
that was good.
We made it through quite a bit.
It's part of five. It's better if you
Here's
say
my
it.
admonition to you for the week, and to myself. Remember that we are frail creatures of dust, and so is everyone else you see. We share that in common. And I think there's a lot of connection through the rest of Scripture to that idea that leads us back to the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you as well. As we move to our prayer concern time, let me give you an update